Now, it has not been an uncommon experience that when I encounter someone for the first time, maybe let's say sitting next to another person on a plane and engaging in the chit-chat that often happens when strangers meet and are forced to sit next to each other for an extended period of time, that the conversation will usually get around to what we do for a living. Invariably, I find myself hesitant to talk about my occupation because I know sharing that I am a pastor tends to be met with a little awkwardness. Inevitably, they would say, that's great. Try to hide the rum and coke they just ordered from the stewardess. Then a look of guilt sometimes might come across their face, and they'll say, I used to go to church when I was a kid, or I'm spiritual but just not religious, as if they needed to justify themselves to me. And I get this response often enough that I usually don't like to tell people what I do for a living. I've even come up with some ideas. I'm a teacher, or I sometimes shade the truth and say I work for a global nonprofit organization. What strikes me, though, about these conversations, people's responses to me as a pastor, is a certain expectation and characterization they carry about who I am, not simply as a pastor, but as a Christian. They assume they know my politics. They assume they know my stance on social issues such as abortion and homosexuality. And they assume I desire to convert them from their heathen ways, when all I really want to do is drink the beer I just ordered from the stewardess. Now, I've gotten used to these interactions over the years, and it really doesn't bother me much anymore. But what does bother me in some ways is people's notion about what it means to be a Christian. Now, I understand for some people their ideas of being a Christian might come from popular culture or from politics or from some of the preachers, I cringe to say, some of the preachers they see on television. Or possibly for many of them, they grew up in a guilt-inducing church atmosphere more focused on hell insurance than faith. And so I am always flabbergasted so much by these misconceptions. The label Christian is these misconceptions that one needs to overcome in order to even connect to other people. Being a Christian, unfortunately, these days, in how it's perceived or how it's identified, sometimes gets in the way of even talking to each other. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of you also find yourselves maybe hesitant in sharing that you're a Christian for the same reason. How people respond and characterize what that means. And I often wonder if I did a random sample on the street and asked them to identify characteristics of being a Christian, what would people say? And I guess for some, there'd be some positive characteristics. But more and more these days, as people of all ages, particularly younger people, are choosing non-religious as a status, a category for their descriptions of faith, I believe they find the word Christians troubling. That some of those characteristics would come across as judgmental, critical, condemnatory, defined by who and what we reject, unbending in our faith, in our thinking, and hypocritical. And that makes me incredibly sad. Now, I may be assuming more than is true, but I don't think so. I don't think so, in part because I'm not sure we who identify ourselves as Christians could say ourselves. What is the central identifying characteristic of our faith? Is there a single word that would describe and characterize who and what a Christian is? Not, in this case, the most important belief of our faith, but the one quality that ought to identify us if people met us, a one quality they would experience with us that would identify us as a follower of Christ. A quality that people would see and say, that is a Christian. Now, the writer of 1 John is wrestling with that question. The writer of 1 John is writing to a community of a burgeoning community of new Christians, and they're wrestling with beliefs about God and who God is. They're wrestling, trying to understand what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And the writer of 1 John, in this letter and in other letters, essentially asserts that there is one simple and direct quality that defines all Christians. It is love. Love is the defining feature of God, and therefore the defining feature of our Christ, and the defining feature of those who claim to be his followers. 1 John flows out of the Gospel of John, in which Jesus on Maundy Thursday, Commandment Thursday, tells his disciples, just as I have loved you, love one another. And the writer of 1 John has carried this and said, this is who we're supposed to be. People who love. And it isn't some namby-pamby feeling. The writer, he or she, writes in this text and simply states, we know love by this. This is what love is. That he laid down his life, and we ought to lay down our lives for each other. No, love isn't simply being kind, though that's certainly a characteristic of love. Love isn't simply being nice. Love is a willingness to lay down one's life for one another. And then the writer of this passage goes on to say, well, how does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help? That the characteristic of love of who we are abiding in God and God abides in us is a love that lays down its life for others and a love that sees those in need and responds. And so the writer wants to make it clear and says to the disciples of this church, little children, let us love not in word and speech. Let us love not simply in say we love the world, not simply in things we say in words or confessions, but in truth and action. In truth and in action. It's like the hymn, they'll know we are Christians by our love in truth and in action. And the writer follows this up by saying, it is by this kind of love that we will know we are from truth. And it is by obeying this commandment to love one another, we show the truth we believe in Jesus Christ. Love is our primary confession of being a disciple of Jesus Christ. It is and should be the quality that defines our community, our lives. A love that serves, a love that helps, a love that embraces. Now, this morning, in a few minutes, we will be having the baptism of Barrett Larson. And in the baptism, a beautiful ceremony, we recognize the promises Barrett's parents make to him, the promises that his extended family make to him, the promises we as a church make to him. And those promises are that he is going to know the love of God. That's primarily what those promises simply describe. That he, in his life, is going to know God claims his life by the love he experiences in his parents and in this church. And we are making promises that we will teach him about the Bible. He needs to know the stories of the Bible. We will teach him about the amazing truth of Jesus, this amazing man who showed how love could transform the world. But really, what we're supposed to be teaching and what we do teach him, and really what a church is it's a school of love. That really, in our teaching of Barrett, in our care for Barrett and his parents, in our care for each other, when we model for him, we are teaching him the most important distinction of being a follower of Christ, that we love each other. Not simply something we say, but something we do each and every day. That is what will define him in the school of love. That is what will define him as a follower of Jesus. It's what we're supposed to be teaching each other and all our kids, how to love. The most important lesson of being the church. Now, many of you have already heard the news about Lois Mertes, and we are brokenhearted at her sudden death. But I could not help but think, as I'm writing the sermon after that news, what a great embodiment of love. You talk about someone who lived love. I cannot and will know I will immensely miss in the passing of the peace her big hugs. And you felt hugged by God. You talk about someone who embodied the most primary characteristic of what it meant to be a follower of Jesus, in the way she loved her family, the way she loved us, the way she loved her community by volunteering at Cross Outreach. All of us are brokenhearted because we knew that love. But as Paul says, love never dies. And it's a part of us. And it's only when we forget that love is who we are and love is who God is, it is only when we forget that we forget who and what we are. One of my favorite all-time movies, a movie made, I think, came out in 2000, a movie called Chocolat. And I've probably referred to this movie quite often. It's an amazing movie, and the general story of that movie is this small French town very much caught up in being somber and serious and very much defining itself by what it rejects. And the movie begins at the beginning of Lent, a season in which one rejects and tries to discipline oneself. And it's a very somber and joyless place. And the movie is about a woman and her daughter who comes in and opens up a chocolate shop, and about how she helps people see life in abundance and the goodness of chocolate. It's much more profound than what I am describing. And one of the characters, not a primary character, but one of the characters is a young priest at the church at the heart of the village whose sermons most weeks get written by the mayor, who's this dour, sour person who thinks the way of salvation is to reject and to exclude. Until he has this epiphany, and he would write the priest's sermons until Easter morning, when events have led to him being unable to, and this young priest who looks like a teenager comes to the pulpit, a packed church on Easter morning, no text prepared for him, and he says a very powerful sermon. And he asks, do I want to speak of the miracle of our Lord's divine transformation? Not really, he says, no. I don't want to talk about his divinity. I'd rather talk about his humanity. I mean, how he lived his life here on earth. His kindness, his tolerance. Listen, here's what I think. I think we can't go around measuring our goodness by what we don't do, by what we deny ourselves, what we resist, and who we exclude. I think we've got to measure goodness by what we embrace, what we create, and who we include. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.